Hello, good afternoon. My name is Rinka Stahuljak. I'm a professor of comparative literature here and French and director of the Center for Early Global Studies, CMRS Center for Early Global Studies. The Richard and Mary Rouse History of the Book lecture series was established in 1993 through the efforts of Richard and Mary Rouse. The series provides an annual venue for internationally recognized authorities on medieval and Renaissance books and manuscripts to present their expertise here at UCLA. This annual event has actually been one of the longest, most successful programs that we've been running at the center, as I said, since 1993. And it was renamed as From the History of the Book to the Richard and Mary Rouse History of the Book lecture in 2016 in honor of the two of them. I'm very sorry to say that Mary Rouse could not be here with us today for probably the first time. But we wish her well and a good recovery. Funding for the series began with an anonymous challenge grant in 1993 that served as the foundation for the History of the Book Lecture Fund. And it is since that time that actually the lecture series has run exclusively on the gifts by individual donors. So I thank many of you who are here with us today, those of you who are with us online. Thank you for your continued support, and please do keep enjoying our programming and keep supporting us. A committee of CMRS faculty members meets annually, and associates meets annually to propose speakers and to set up the next year's lecture. Currently serving on the committee are Professors Matthew Fisher of English, who chairs it, Dr. Devin Fitzgerald, Curator of Global Book History and History of Printing at the UCLA Special Collections, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, Senior Curator of Manuscripts at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and Professor Luke Yarbrough of the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. And I'm very grateful to them for selecting, proposing, and hosting this 34th lecture that will be given by Professor Daniel Hobbins of Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. Just a few more words. As we celebrate the Black History Month, I do want to emphasize how the center's decision to become the Center for Early Global Studies in 2021 allowed us to renew the study of the past from diverse viewpoints across the world. The center champions a new understanding of global studies. We see all areas of the world as equally epistemologically productive as we pursue comparison and polycentricity of a global before the globalized, while still remaining firmly grounded in disciplinarity and in expanding our understanding of Europe, as I believe this talk will fully exemplify. And now, Dr. Devin Fitzgerald, Curator of Global Book History and History of Printing at the UCLA Library, who will introduce Professor Hobbins. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Zrinka, and it is a real pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Daniel Hobbins tonight. This, for me, is a real moment of vengeance because Dr. Hobbins' book was on my general exams list. And perhaps more than any other book I read in 2011 was responsible for me becoming a book historian in many ways. So Dr. Hobbins is really at fault for many, many sins. But without further ado, I'd just like to tell you a little bit more about him. Daniel Hobbins is a historian of high and late medieval Europe with a particular interest in the cultural, religious, and intellectual history of the period from 1200 to 1500. Under this broad heading, his research is focused on authorship, manuscript culture, textual transmission, the Carthusian order, and 15th century France. His book, Authorship and Publicity Before Print, 2009, received the Jacques Barzun Prize from the American Philosophical Society, and he is currently completing a book on the history and meaning of the authorial colophon. Just a little bit more about that book that's not on his bio. I remember when we were reading this in our reading group at Harvard, It was, in some ways, the best answer to many of the questions that were at the center of book history in the 2000s, which is what did authorship and publication look like outside of societies oriented around the printing press? And publicity before print really did a phenomenal job showing that it wasn't the Eisensteinian print revolution that allowed pre-modern Europe to avail itself of the affordances of the printing press. But in fact, there were already modes of scribal publication and circulation of information that were preconditions for a mass media, multimedia society that existed before Gutenberg and therefore allowed for the press to flourish. In other words, the press was the right tool at the right time, but the cultural conditions of late medieval and Renaissance Europe were already ripe for such a technology to arrive. And I think as a global history center, this is a very important argument because it reminds us that Europe is a specific place and that even if print arrived in Japan, say, well, 762 is the first printed object in Japanese history, then the reasons for the print revolution in Japan in the 17th century must be localized in the same way as these histories in Western Europe. And I remember this being incredibly exciting. And especially with all of his research, for example, the Jean Gearson manuscript database put the empirical punch behind this phenomenal research. And so it's my great pleasure then to introduce Dr. Hobbins to give us a lecture on something that will hopefully corrupt a new generation of graduate students. The origins of the authorial colophon in the Latin West. So thank you.
Thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to come to UCLA, my first trip here, hopefully not my last. It's a special honor to come here. It's especially gratifying, I suppose, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Richard and Mary Rouse have been their scholarship. I met them once, but it's their scholarship that has really pioneered the path which I'm trying to take, and the focus on their focus on the high, but also the most overlooked period of medieval books and book culture, the 14th and 15th centuries. I'm also happy to finally come and see the CMRS. I'm a graduate of an institution like that, and so these centers for the study of our period are so important, and this is one of the best in the country. I graduated from the Medieval Institute at the University of Notre Dame, but also my advisor, John Van Ingen. I don't know how well he's known around here, but he was I would think he is. He gave this talk probably 10, 12 years ago, and he would always talk. He was my dissertation advisor, and he would always talk about his time at UCLA, which was so important to him. And so I'm finally glad to, and I told him I'm coming, and so he's eager to hear how it goes. But I want to jump right in. Actually, I just realized that I got so carried away that I didn't hand out my handout. So let me do that. If you could take care of that, actually. Okay. All right. I think we're all set. I'd like to begin with this colophon from a Brussels manuscript of a work called the Spirituale Pomerium, a spiritual orchard, of Henri van der Bulgaire. In the late 19th century, this manuscript, and this is number one in your handout. So the handout and the slideshow usually are showing the same thing. In the late 19th century, this manuscript, a small volume of 25 paper folios, came to the attention of experts on early woodblock printing. The manuscript would have attracted little attention if not for the fact that it included 12 prints illustrating the work. A date appears at the conclusion, 1440. Well, seizing on this colophon, several experts assumed that the date of 1440 was scribal and thus indicated when the entire volume was assembled. Now, if true, it was the key to an unsolved historical mystery. The colophon apparently supplied an ironclad date for the introduction of woodblock printing. The early chronology of print seemed to be falling in place. The Cabinet des États of the Bibliothèque Royale, thinking it had found a smoking gun, hurried the volume off to a special vault. Well, this was all based on a misreading of the evidence, as maybe you've already pieced together. In particular, the words editum et completum, which refer to the composition of the work rather than the copy. In 1923, Auguste Vincennes pushed the date of the manuscript back to at least 1450. The woodblocks themselves might date from a decade or two later. In short, we have here not a scribal colophon, but what I'll call an authorial colophon that was later recopied. I've been thinking about authorial colophons for some time, actually a lot longer than I was ever planning on thinking of them. And I hope that you won't mind if I use this opportunity this afternoon to share some of my thoughts about them. They present a kind of paradox, which is, on the one hand, they're abundant. Many of them are actually printed. On the other hand, a few have actually, to continue that point, a few are actually critical pieces of evidence in important controversies. At the same time, in our scholarship, they don't really exist as a category of evidence. Unrecognized for what they are, they have no history. What exactly does it mean that authors were doing this? Anything at all? Nothing? Now, those who work closely with the material evidence will have encountered these before. The great collections of manuscrits datés, hundreds and probably over 100 volumes by now. They document hundreds more in authorial colophons, usually though they're tucked away in appendices under the heading of manuscrits éliminés, manuscripts mistakenly dated in earlier scholarship, often because a scholar looked at a colophon and thought it was giving him the date of copying when it was like this text giving him the date of composition. The introductions to these volumes sometimes mention authorial colophons, but only as a nuisance. So what do you do with them? Well, you want to get them out of the way, and so you push them in an appendix because they're not telling you what the date of the handwriting is. That's what you want. Yet one might also consider the possibility that this is a case of collective myopia, a failure to recognize a practice that has implications for the history of authorship. Not scribes, but authors. So great is the interest in scribes, it may be surprising to discover that authorial colophons are much richer than scribal colophons. Of course, scribal colophons can be interesting and tantalizing. Scribes tell us about copying from corrupted exemplars. They mention current events. Excuse me. They report on the weather or an outbreak of plague or mention a comet or an eclipse. But such colophons are actually pretty unusual and, dare we say it, the very definition of trivial, concerned with details that in most cases have nothing to do with history of the book. The nature of scribal colophons is such, furthermore, that they become formulaic, with certain formulas prevailing in certain regions and gaining general currency in some cases for centuries. An important study of scribal colophons identified 29 formulas that in their various forms appear, on average, in over 200 colophons. 29 formulas repeated 200 times, each one of them, at least. Now, while authors might resort to formulas and conventions in their colophons, authorial colophons never came to be governed by them to the same extent as scribal colophons. An author who supplies a colophon to his text has a natural advantage over the scribe. Privileged information, not just about one copy of the text, but about its composition. An author could tell readers not just where and when that one copy was made, but where and when the original text was composed. But then an author knew still other information that a reader might wish to know: to whom the text was sent, under what conditions the text was composed. So Thomas Mallory, for example, tells us he's writing from prison. We get that in the colophon, and 100 other details. Or consider this colophon by William of Moorbeck to his translation of the commentary of Simplicius on De Celo. This is number 2 on, on the handout. Moorbeck spent decades translating almost all of the Aristotelian corpus directly from Greek. His translation soon became standard in the university curriculum. Here, Moorbeck speaks like a scribe, complaining of weariness. But then in the very same breath, so the weariness, magno labore corporis, et multo tedio mentis. In the same breath, he speaks of having made an important contribution to the world. Latinitati offero. I offer this to the Latin world, we might translate. And then again, later on in the colophon, I have added much to the studies of the Latins. Now, much of the scholarship on Moorbeck's translations takes as its starting point his strategy of literal translation. This is often what these studies of translation start from. That's a kind of topos or a governing assumption by these authors themselves that they're being very literal. But a colophon like this also reveals how Moorbeck viewed his role in the enterprise of translations. He imagines his audience not as 1 or 2 readers, but as all of Latin Christendom. We couldn't be farther removed from the humility topoi of the scribes. In this colophon, Moorbeck already sees his work being reproduced in multiple copies far from his current location. Probably in large part because he was a member of the Dominican order, and he could count on that order to spread these works. So his scribal way of thinking went hand in hand with his sense of a large audience. Most of the time, not always, most of the time, one can assume that a colophon is authorial if it includes a date of composition or some other piece of privileged information. If gathered into a collection, like the scribal colophons are, authorial colophons might constitute an inventory of dated works, as opposed to just dated copies. And they might reveal patterns in the ways that authors talked about their own compositions. They might offer a source of comparison for the development of inscriptions on stone and signatures on painting. Yet the effort to catalog dated scribal colophons has not generated the slightest reflection on dated authorial colophons. They make for a confusing sort of evidence to be set aside rather than an interesting practice in its own right. So despite all of our interest in authorship, we have not a single study, not one article, devoted to the practice of the author signing off by means of a colophon. But this is a practice I want to suggest here today, whose meaning is not self-evident, and that calls for recognition, reflection, and interpretation. So my starting point with this whole business is that, like the scribal colophon, the authorial colophon can be defined in a meaningful way and even given a history. And then from that assumption, I propose to investigate the history of the practice, to trace its origins and its spread. That's one part of the project. And then to tease out the meaning of the practice, what it means that authors were doing this. And so just to give you a sense of what I'm trying, the larger project, which I'm taking this from, this is kind of the table of contents of the book. So first of all, part 1, definitions, working through, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but there are a lot of methodological problems that when you're dealing with something that has been recopied, you don't have the immediate handwriting of the author. You have to work through, and then the history, and then the meaning. So I'm going to be kind of pulling from, especially from chapters 5 and 6. So I'm going to be focusing here more on that first part, the history, and essentially trying to locate the first appearance of the authorial colophon in the West. And then I'm going to propose a model that might help us to understand how and why this practice spread. My core assumption is that the authorial colophon derived from the scribal colophon. Its language and formulas clearly echo scribal language and formulas. So in that way, It was a conservative device, rooted in scribal practice, but employed by authors who were more often acting as their own scribes. In fact, I propose that the authors who employed it did so without any sense that they were innovating. Okay, so first, a basic chronology. No early medieval author used the Authorial Colophon. In fact, it appears to have a surprising birthplace, the world of the translators from Arabic to Latin in the 12th century Iberia. And so we can turn there next. In the early 12th century, the great project of translating lost Greek texts and Arabic wisdom into Latin turned decisively to Iberia. As Christian kings began to win important military victories, a wave of translations followed. And at the end of these translations, these scholars began to add colophons, indicating the completion of the text and sometimes giving their name. They often made clear that the work had been translated from Arabic to Latin. Sometimes they specified the date and the place. A striking example of this is Plato of Tivoli's colophon to his translation of the Liber Nativitatum of Abu Ali, or Abu Ali al-Khayyat, which dates both the original work, the original Arabic work, and the translation. And it even provides a horoscope for the moment of the work's completion. This is number 3 on the handout, and it appears in this form in a London Digby manuscript. So I won't read all this. It's really telling us very basic information. He's first of all telling you in the end of the first line there, it's translated from Arabic to Latin by Plato in Barcelona. And then the third line, qui factus est, that's the original work, the year of the Arabs 425. But the translation was completed in 530, year of the Arabs, so that Muslim dating. And then he goes on and gives a horoscope, which I won't take you through, but that's what all that is. So the reference here in the colophon to the date of the original work, the work of Abu Ali, is a clue, right? He's giving you the date of the original work. So that's a clue, I think, that Plato was probably imitating the Arabic precedent in his dating. Now, this colophon is one of several left by Plato between the years 1134 to 1145. Another translator he may have known, John of Seville, was at the same time supplying his works with colophons in a similar manner, including the date and the place. And this is the next item on the handout. One example. There are quite a lot of them. These much more simpler, just simply telling us that the work was completed and that John of Seville was the one translating from Arabic into Latin. Now, these colophons have been known since the early, both Plato and John of Seville, since the early 20th century, and they're vital to any reconstruction of the translation project. It's through colophons that we understand the mechanics of translation from Arabic through the vernacular into Latin, often with the help of a rabbi, by the way. Without them, our understanding of the history of scientific translations in Iberia would be crippled. For figures like Plato and John of Seville, they provide almost all that we know of their biographies. The spread of knowledge from the Muslim world to the Latin West has long held a privileged place in the master narrative of medieval history. In Haskins' reconstruction, it's central. The Latin translations that began to appear in the second half of the 10th century were part of a much broader cultural appropriation, though, across the entire Iberian Peninsula. An appropriation that included, besides subjects like algebra and astronomy, astrology, but there were also other things passing from one culture to the next, things like Arabic numerals, astrolabes, even the game of chess. So too, it seems, came the colophons. Before the early 12th century, we can't find a single Latin author who employed the colophon in this way. You can look for it, but you won't find it. I've been looking for 15 years. Yet authors writing in Arabic and even in Hebrew were using colophons already. It seems then that the Authorial Colophon had moved from the Arabic to the Latin world. Now, how do we explain that movement? It seems that the cultural context in Iberia was more favorable than elsewhere in Europe for the emergence of this new written practice. Now, the inclusion of a date is an important clue, although not in John of Seville, not in this one, but in Plato and many of the other ones. In contrast to the Latin West, where dating by the incarnation, the Anno Domini, remained unusual even beyond the year 1000, Islamic civilization had adopted the year of the Hijra already by the year 16. Soon, Muhammad's followers were dating letters, treatises, and coins using this system. Coins, by the way, are never explicitly dated in the Latin West. Over time, this tendency to date finished works extended to almost the entire field of medieval culture, the entire field of material culture, including, by the 10th century, textiles. Again, we're talking about the Arab world. Metalwork and woodwork, astrolabes, luxury ceramics, even carpets. Muslim elites lived in a world of dated texts and objects, and as a result, developed a common chronological point of reference. Now, it's clear that scribal and authorial colophons both appeared earlier and in much greater numbers in the Islamic world than in the Latin West. So let's take scribal colophons first. Dated scribal colophons appear in Arabic manuscripts from the 9th century. Compare this to the Latin West. E.A. Lowe in the Codices Latini Antiquiores, which is it's a collection of 1900 manuscripts from before the year 800. In that collection, you could find 5, at most 10, dated colophons. They survive in greater numbers after the year 800, but they remain rare to the year 1000, and in all honesty, even beyond that, up to the mid-13th century. Dated colophons become much more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially. The works of Hugh of St. Victor illustrate this well. Hugh, a 12th century author, his works survive in 12th century manuscripts. We have 850 of them, 852. One of those copies is dated. By contrast, we have numerous dated copies of his works from the 14th and 15th centuries. So the dated colophon is really a product of the late medieval world in substantial numbers. Now, it's a striking fact, back to Iberia, it's a striking fact for us here that the earliest dated scribal colophons in Latin, outside of a few scattered and random examples from Carolingian Europe, come from the Christian kingdoms in Iberia in the 10th century. This is a full century ahead of the rest of Europe. This is something that Bernard Bischoff knew well. While we can find early examples elsewhere in Europe, it was in Iberia that the practice first became normative. Likewise, the authorial colophon had become commonplace in the Islamic world long before it appeared in the Latin West. Jewish scholars writing in Hebrew and living under Muslim rule borrowed the practice. Maimonides is one example. He dated his commentary in the Mishnah. It's number 5 on your handout. Sorry, this is not it. Do I have it? Okay, sorry. I don't actually have it. That's right. I don't actually have it on the slides, but it's number 5 on the handout. He indicates the length of time required to complete the project as well. In the second half of the 12th century, Averroes was using colophons to date many of his works from Cordoba, Seville, and Morocco. So it seems then that the authors of these Latin translations, Plato and John of Seville, immersed in Muslim culture and reading and admiring texts from that culture, otherwise why are they translating them, and desiring to translate them, likewise translated this practice of dating their works in colophons. That's the working hypothesis, right? Plato's colophons repeat the earlier date of composition again, before supplying the date of his own translation. The original work was composed in 1033 and 1034, the translation in 1136, right? So Plato is simply following Arabic practice. There's a lot more to say about Plato's colophons than we will here. A number of them he wrote over a 12-year period, often using the exact same kind of language, the same formulas. Language that, if we just pause here for a second, puts forward a claim to be doing more than just mechanical translation. Again, that's the kind of standard. Everybody's talking that way. This is word for word. Verbum de verbo. That's the third. But what are we doing? What do we see here? There seems to be a hint of a desire for renown. Otherwise, what's that horoscope for? It's the birth of the work. So a project then, in some of these colophons, of identity building, potentially, as with William of Moerbeck. We could also talk about the colophons of John of Seville, whose language is laced with formulations drawn from Arabic patterns of writing, perfectus est. Almost certainly a phrase coming out of Arabic practice, as well as sub laude Dei adjutorio eius. And his colophons, therefore, testify to the deep imprint of Muslim culture on these translators. But for now, we'll push ahead. Now, in the form that one sees it in the early translators, the Authorial Colophon simply didn't exist anywhere in Latin Europe before 1130. Now, this history is interesting insofar as it locates this change in practice to one time and place, if what I'm saying holds. But the practice itself is important because it endured. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many authors turned to it reflexively and relied on it to communicate vital information about their texts. A figure like Ramon Lull, early 14th century. We have over 100 Authorial Colophons. And as a result, you can reconstruct his career with a kind of detail that you could never do for a 12th century author. So now I'd like to suggest that the spread itself is meaningful, perhaps even an important new chapter in the history of medieval authorship. Now, as we turn to the problem of the spread of the colophon, we have to scrutinize the language that we're using to describe that historical process. In fact, I've already built an assumption into my narrative by referring to the spread of the practice. To say that the colophon spread seems to imply that authors are copying each other. They're seeing earlier authors do this, and they're imitating that practice. In fact, it seems more plausible, given what we know about authorship in the 12th century, that authors were instead, who do this, were actually behaving like the scribes, who are now more frequently putting colophons at the ends of their copies. So consider the world of writing in which these authors are immersed by the 13th century. More scribes supplying their copies with colophons, an increase in colophons. At the same time, more authors acting as their own scribes. That's the new part. The rise of autograph composition. In such a situation, it would have been entirely natural for an author who was writing by hand then to absorb the colophon into his own practice and apply it to the composition rather than to the copy. And so in other words, given that more authors are now copying rather than dictating their texts, as authors had done from antiquity up into the 12th century, it was probably inevitable that some authors would apply the colophon to authorship without any idea that they were innovating. So to illustrate this process, how authors were absorbing the colophon into their own written practice, let's turn to the case of Frère Angier, an early translator of Gregory the Great into French. Brother Angier was a canon at the Augustinian Priory of St. Friedswyde in Oxford. And on 29 November, 1212, he completed a task that had taken him years, a translation into rhyming French couplets of the dialogues of Gregory the Great, a work of over 20,000 lines of verse. Four lines before the end, he identifies himself as the old sinner Angier, cloistered for 7 years. And that reference allows us to resolve the Latin colophon that follows, where the translator names himself only as Frater A. So that's the number 6 on the handout, I think. And this is the manuscript, and here is then a close-up of the colophon. So here ends the work, if you translate it, of my hands that I have completed. Brother A, ego frater A, subdeacon, least of the servants of St. Friedzweig, and so on, and then he gives a date. Angier had chosen to translate the dialogues as a way of offering its spiritual benefits to those who could not read Latin. In this way, the work is pastoral at its core. Completed just 3 years, by the way, before we're 1212. 1215, Fourth Lateran's going to come in and launch a campaign to catechize the masses of baptized Christians. So it seems like he's already caught the spirit of the age. 2 years later, he translated into French verse a life of Gregory, Jean Diacre's Vita Gregorii Magni. Sorry, this is not, I think on the, it's number 7 on the handout. Yeah. Angier here again dates the translation with reference to his conversion to religion. Now, almost all that we know of Angier comes from these 2 colophons. It's about all we know. Yet scholars have devoted a lot of attention to him, and mainly because he copied his own works by hand. And also he's writing in French at an early date. But therefore, this manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale can lay claim to being one of our oldest surviving autographs in French, possibly the oldest. Well, it would seem that way, but in fact, there's a controversy about this. You have some scholars on the one hand who are favoring this as an autograph, and another scholar in the last few years has challenged this claim. So I want to let's kind of disentangle the issues here. There are 2 related questions. First, there's this narrow material question about whether or not the manuscript is an autograph. Written fair copy, so a fair copy. Written in Angier's own hand. And second, there's the broader, we can't lose sight of the broader question of historical significance. How can this example help us write the history of the practice? So let's talk about that material question first. A lot depends on how we interpret the colophon to the dialogues. In particular, the phrase opus manuum Meorum, excuse me. It's the Meorum, actually, is what the manuscript says. The work of my hands. Opus, it's in the first line. Opus manuum mearum. This phrase is the work of my hands. It's not found in any of the inventories of colophons. It doesn't appear in that study I referred to, an important study of colophons. It doesn't appear in any of the classical dictionaries. Now, in 2011, Ian Short challenged earlier scholars who saw this as a reference to autograph composition. And he proposed instead that it was simply referring to his authorship. There were scribes nearby that he could have employed. Why would he have copied it himself? That was part of his reasoning. But then several other scholars basically just kind of pushed back and insisted on the original solution, that it's actually referring to the copying. I think there is a third possibility here that I'd like to explore. If one reads Angier's colophons with an ear sensitive to their language and context, one might describe their entire texture as liturgical. Both of the colophons that we looked at mark time according to a feast day and measure time from Angier's conversion to the religious life. The first colophon refers to his religious community, and concludes, look at the end, with a kind of doxology. Qui cum Patre et Spiritus Sancto vivit et regnat de per infinita seculorum. It's like it's a doxology. And in fact, the whole codex that this is in, introduces the translation as a kind of liturgical procession. Angier begins the whole translation with an invocatio, which includes the hymn Veni Creator Spiritus, followed by an antiphon, and concluding with a prayer. One scholar, Renato Orengo, has even proposed the possibility that a set of accents that was added to the work was so that it might be actually chanted. And I think these clues are pointing to the solution, which is the phrase opus manuum mearum comes from Isaiah 19:24-25, which entered the liturgy as a reading for the office in the form of a responsory verse in the summer months, probably at matins. Benedictus populus meus et opus manuum mearum. That's certainly the form in which Angier encountered and digested this language. Here ends the work of my hands, he says in the colophon, implying that that work, it's echoing in his own head, that verse. He's hearing the whole register of the verse, implying that that work is truly blessed. So the overtones of that phrase are lost to us now, but they must have resonated in the minds of Angier's brothers. So the phrase then is metaphorical rather than literal. Unfortunately, it seems that this solution doesn't really answer the question. It still leaves the question of the autograph status of the manuscript ambiguous. But I think that the ambiguity in the language may actually provide a clue to help us answer our second question. What broader historical truth can we draw from this example? Scholars have assumed that the phrase here, opus manuum mearum, must refer to either copying or composing. But I think there's a third possibility, which is that the two activities were so intertwined in Angier's mind that he wasn't distinguishing at all, but collapsing them into one. The composition and the copying are part of the same task, the opus manuum mearum. So the example of Brother Angier then illustrates the general point here, which is that the primary energy for the spread of the authorial colophon came from the imitation of scribal colophons, as authors were more often acting as their own scribes. Angier has collapsed scribal and authorial roles so completely that we can't distinguish his colophon as either scribal or authorial. And it's even possible that he himself didn't distinguish those two roles. I think that's probably likely. It's appropriate then that our first example of this collapsing of roles appears in a monastic author, an individual who copied books as part of a religious vocation, but who now joined to that office the role of translator, as author. Now, Brother Angier is a remarkably early case of this collapsing of roles, but he does illustrate a practice that became more common over time. A later example is Dan Mickle of Northgate, perhaps 1265 to around 1340, perhaps a university student and secular cleric who in his old age professed as a monk at St. Augustine's Abbey at Canterbury. We know almost nothing of his life, as with many of these guys. We know very little beyond what we learned from one work that he may have written, the Ian Bitte of Inwit, translated as Remorse of Conscience, a translation into prose of a work called Le Somme Le Roi of the Dominican Frère Laurent. The work, this translation, survives in a single copy in London. In the prologue, and this is number 8 on the handout, Dan Mickle identifies himself ambiguously as the writer. This book is Dan Michaels of Northgate, Irita. And then it concludes with a colophon written in the same hand as the text. Again, number 8 on the handout. Now, Dan Mickle, we know he possessed a quite coherent library of scientific and religious texts that would have been useful to an advocate of the reform of Christian education that we associate with the agenda of the Fourth Lateran Council. The translation of Le Somme Le Roi, perhaps the most important manual for those laity in search of religious perfection, fits perfectly into this broad agenda. So the authorial colophon, it's another example of how this authorial colophon, by virtue of its descent from the scribal colophon, this is now kind of branching out and sort of thinking a little bit about what this means. What's going on in these authorial colophons? It's a kind of portal to a space outside the text, a space that functioned as a kind of medieval title page. The key to this development is its scribal location. Over the centuries, medieval scribes had transformed the space following the completion of the text into an external space. They had conditioned readers to see that space as a threshold. When you see some formula at the end of a text, you're thinking, okay, this is external to the text. If it's a colophon, it's not the author writing. So scribes had done that work. Authors themselves then, without intending to, I'm not attributing intent to them, but they could draw on the power of this memory to move outside the text, even though if an author writes a colophon, that's still part of the text, unlike what the scribe is doing. So the author draws on the power of that memory to move outside the text figuratively through participation in the colophon's externality, as if the spatial memory of the scribal colophon endured in the authorial colophon. Now, to be clear, that's an illusion. The authorial colophon belonged to the text. It was integral. It was an integral part of it in a way that the scribal colophon was not. But the illusion of externality was so effective that at times it's impossible to tell if a colophon is scribal or authorial. Now, returning back to Brother Angier, the way he uses the colophon is telling. He passes into Latin and takes on a kind of anonymity. Not a pure anonymity, because he just actually named himself, but he also, he gives his initial. Still, this gesture reflects his awareness of a different space outside the text. Materially, look at it, though it's rubricated, the colophon is no different from any of the rubricated headings earlier in the work, actually. So if you were to look at this, you wouldn't assume it's scribal, because it looks just like the other red headings. The text of the colophon is easily distinguished from the text above it, but although the material space is important, we're talking here not about a material, but a mental space. So just as scribes, the point here is that just as scribes use the colophon to think about the text in a material way, so authors are using it to present important details about production of the text. By taking time to record facts of publication, authors were emphasizing their own unique place in time, and thus their own historically specific and unique contribution. Yet they did so without any intent to innovate, or I'm sure any awareness of doing so. Authors found a way to make ambitious claims in the most conservative way possible. Again, not intending to, but that's effectively what they're doing. The authorial colophon worked well because no one thought of it as an innovation. It looks like, sometimes it even is, a scribal colophon. The colophon is not causing this reflection on the material text, but one instrument that allows it and encourages it, one new mechanism that accompanies the growing sophistication of written culture from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Think about what growing sophistication? Well, things like indices, running headers, tables of contents, and many other features. The colophon gave authors an opportunity to sign their texts in a new way, to step outside their text as a mode of discourse, and to reflect on its materiality. That deeper consciousness of the text as a material object must have had implications for their relationship to the text that deserve further consideration. Well, then what are the larger stakes of a project like this? I think it goes back really to a project that I've been working on since the first book. Late medieval book culture was distinct. It was different, not just from the early medieval world of small libraries and isolated monasteries, but also from the high medieval world that continues to dominate our understanding of the period. The continuity of the medium, handwritten books, leads us to collapse all of the medieval period into an age of scribes. And that's true as far as it goes, but its effect is to disguise the transformation of book culture into something that by 1400 would have seemed shocking, not just to a Carolingian scribe, but even to a scribe from the year 1150. I talk about the change from dictation to autograph composition, which happens in the late Middle Ages, introduction of paper, brand new in the Latin world, spread of literacy, the metastasizing of book hands, all those things are happening in the late Middle Ages. The late medieval period was also a distinct area of authorship. What I propose, what I call in the book, a period of artisanal authorship, when authors were heavily involved in the material production of texts. Before this period, authors relegated most of material production to scribes. After this period, printers come to control publication. and pushed authors to the margins. Print is a major culprit of this view that reinforces the notion of a homogeneous world of medieval writing. The late medieval period saw the system of book production reach its most highly developed form in terms of complexity and sophistication, its range of options and availability of texts. The manuscript book production. Not the 12th century, not the 13th, but the 14th and 15th centuries. And I think that's maybe a fitting point to end, because it was a point that Richard Rouse himself made several times, at least, I think, in his own scholarship. Thank you.